Well, welcome everybody to our webinar titled "Lessons Learned from the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance." Just a quick word of thanks for joining, and very much looking forward to this conversation. So a warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are in the world right now. My name is Francisco Yanni. I'm the Global Floods Resilience Coordinator with the IFRC based in Geneva, and I'll be one of your facilitators for this session alongside my co-pilot, Jonathan Ulrich. So with that, just a quick welcome. I will be turning off my camera. I'm having some bandwidth issues, unfortunately. But over to you, John, to go over the agenda and let's get started. Welcome.
Thank you, Francisco. And also a warm welcome from my side. So first of all, please note that we will record this webinar and would like to share the recording afterwards. So if you don't want the recording to be shared, please reach out and we will figure this out. So now please let me quickly walk you through the agenda and some of the rules of the session. First, Francisco will present the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance to you and introduce our speakers. Next, our speakers will have about 10 minutes each to present one of the main learnings that we as the Flood Resilience Alliance learned last year. So first, Karen McClune from ICET International will present what we've learned about critical success factors for influencing policy and spending for flood resilience. Then David Nash from the Z Zurich Foundation will describe our resilience measurement approach and what we've learned about its uses. And then Brenda Avila Flores from the Mexican Red Cross will present how our team in Mexico managed the compounding effects of COVID-19, dengue, and floods. This will be followed by an open discussion. The first part of the discussion will be moderated by Francisco, and then we will open the floor to your questions and comments. So I will need your support to run this webinar as smooth as possible. We're now about a year into the pandemic and slowly getting used to webinars and teleconferences. So let me quickly explain how to WebEx. Please keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar, and you can mute and unmute yourself on the left in the bottom panel to save bandwidth and also ensure a smooth session for everyone, including those with a weaker internet connection. Please turn off your videos. And as said, the presentation will be followed by an open discussion where we want to hear your questions and comments. So you can submit your questions and comments already during our presentations in the chat. We will then pick them up during the discussion, and you will find the chat function at the very right of your screen. So during the discussion, we will also invite you to directly pose your questions and comments to our speakers and to everyone else. And you can do so by using the hand raise function, which you will find on the right at the bottom panel when you click on the three dots. So that's it from me for now. Handing over to you, Francisco, for an introduction to the Alliance.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. And again, welcome everybody. So first, thinking about the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, we start with a question: why floods? Understanding that floods affect more people globally than any other type of natural hazard and cause some of the largest economic, social, and humanitarian losses. In the past 10 years alone, floods have impacted more than 675 million people. And even more people will be impacted with increases in population, urbanization, and economic development in hazard-prone areas, coupled with increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events resulting from climate change. Flood risks are increasingly interconnected and interdependent. Taking into account the challenge just described, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance a multi-sector partnership, was launched in 2013. Its main focus has been and continues to be on finding practical ways to help communities strengthen their resilience to floods. Our vision is that floods have no negative impact on people's and businesses' ability to thrive. Our goal is to increase social, political, and financial investment in community-based flood resilience building through public, private, and third sector partnerships. And collectively, by 2024, the Alliance partners aim to increase the investment going into pre-event resilience building by $1 billion. We commit to scaling up our work in climate action and to help make 2 million people more resilient to flooding. We will do this by rolling out best practice community programs that demonstrate the value of resilience building, compiling best practices and success stories, and advocating for more investment in resilience with authorities and public and private funders. And we also commit to sharing our knowledge on our own Alliance Flood Resilience portals. So in the first phase of the Alliance, we were 5 organizations working together. And now in the second phase, the Alliance comprises of 9 partners. We have Zurich Insurance Group, working with the INGOs Concern Worldwide, Mercy Corps, Plan International, and Practical Action, as well as the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the IFRC, and research partners, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, the London School of Economics, LSE, and the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition International, ISET. So reflecting on the slide you see before you, it's a list of all our country programs that you see on the screen. I think it's important to highlight here that we remain very committed to working at the local level. And while national and global level decisions contribute to building resilience, the impacts of flooding are felt most immediately at the community level. The community level is also where many resilience building actions can be taken, and communities often know best how and where they need to build resilience. Working with and through communities, we can demonstrate tangible impacts on people's lives and develop best practices, which can help shape policy at a higher level. Next slide, please. So in this slide is just a bit of background on what we call our Alliance Learning Reports. Phase 2 of the Flood Resilience Alliance was launched in July 2018. Year 1 ran from July 2018 through June 2019. And this year largely focused on setting up our internal systems and structures to achieve our broader objectives. And if you want to learn more about the Alliance and how we're set up, we'll share links later on in the presentation that also include information on our Year 1 learning report titled Foundations for Change. In Year 2, from July 2019 through June 2020, the Alliance organizations started to implement resilience programming in communities and move forward with influencing policy and spending in the flood resilience, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, and climate change adaptation arenas. In the Year 2 report, we review the progress made towards the Alliance objectives, where we stand relative to our goals, and most importantly, and it's the essence of the conversation we'll be having today, what we have learned about building flood and multi-hazard resilience as a result of grappling with the COVID-19 crisis. The information included in this report has been gathered from our unique reporting system and also complemented by interviews with Alliance members. Next slide, please. I think with that, I just want to briefly introduce our 3 speakers for the conversation. First, we'll hear from Karen McClune. Her intervention will focus on influencing policy and spending. What does it take to affect change? Karen is Executive Director of ICET International. ICET's role within the Alliance is to support knowledge integration across organizations, work streams, and geographies. One of the ways ICET delivers this role is through the annual review of the Alliance reporting and leading on the creation of the annual Alliance Learning Reports. Karen has worked with the Alliance since 2014. After Karen, we'll hear from David Nash, and his intervention will focus on measurement as a foundational approach. David is the Climate Change and Partnerships Senior Manager at the Zurich Foundation, which works with people and communities to build a better, more resilient future by helping them to understand and protect themselves from the risks they face. David has been a member of the Alliance since 2013. Then we'll hear from Brenda Avila Flores. Her intervention will focus on resilience during crisis. Brenda is the Resilience Program Coordinator at the national headquarters of the Mexican Red Cross. In this role, Brenda can draw on her long experience of working on vulnerability, climate risks, communication strategies, and environmental education for various government, research, and NGO institutions. Brenda has been a member of the Alliance since 2016. I think with that, we'll hand over the microphone to you, Karen, to start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Francisco. And if I could have the next slide. So, as Francisco mentioned, a couple of the goals of the Alliance are influencing a substantial sum of money into pre-event action around flood resilience and improving the policy that dictates how that money is spent. And so as part of the year, well, as part of every learning report, we take a look at how are we doing against those goals? Where are we progressing? What does that progress look like? And what has it taken to affect the change that we're seeing? And in the year 2 learning report, we generated this graphic to encapsulate what we were seeing in the reporting around how we are achieving change in how we're influencing policy and funding. And it's complicated. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to kind of walk people through this. So if you look at the diagram, you see sort of a tangle of things at the top that form one pathway with a couple of sort of side paths that link from the left side, where we begin with some initial stakeholder engagement, to our ultimate goal on the right side, where we have improved policy and increased investment in flood resilience. At the bottom, you see a very direct path. And then between them, you see what happens if you don't do this work, which is flooding causes losses and damages, unless pre-event action is taken. That's where we're trying to get people to focus. Let's take action before events occur so that we don't have to sort of experience those damages, those impacts, or that they're at least less and we can recover more quickly. So I'm going to start by talking about the top, more complicated path, because that's probably where the bulk of our work is. Next slide, please. And that path is really highlighting 3 different things that we're seeing happening across the Alliance. The first is we're having success in our influencing where we have teams that are working on not just community programming, but really connecting that programming to advocacy and seeking to use the successes from the programming to influence both spending and policy across different levels in their countries. So from local all the way up to subnational and national levels. And the Mexico Red Cross, represented by Brenda on this call today, has had, is one of our really shining examples of success in this with their Community Brigades program. What's been really impressive about that program is not just the way that they were able to institutionalize that in the Tabasco State Development Plan, not just the way they won awards from it, but the persistence with which they just kept building from really good community programming all the way up. They identified a need on the ground, both for faster response to disasters and for more sort of social cohesion around responding to flood disasters in their communities, built a mechanism that could help fill that gap, but then consistently communicated and took advantage of working with Zurich in Mexico to kind of amplify their voice and reach other stakeholders to just keep communicating the value of this work. And we've seen these really clear successes as a result of that. And so that successful programming really built credibility and then allowed their advocacy work to be informed by an understanding of what was needed to really affect change and make people more resilient on the ground. The second thing we see is success where Alliance has been able to leverage emerging and ongoing policy windows. This has been particularly visible in the work that Practical Action Nepal has done, where they ran the Flood Resilience Measurement for Communities tool. They were working with communities to really understand, okay, what does this tell us about this community? What does this tell us about where we might want to take action? But then they took that community understanding and the co-created actions that the community wanted to move forward with and brought it to the municipal stakeholders, and were able to get it pulled into the annual planning process and therefore funded through the annual planning process. And so by knowing that, you know, when the windows were for this municipal planning, knowing the kinds of processes that they needed to feed into in order to influence those plans and get community priorities taken up in those plans, they were able to actually institutionalize some of the activities locally. And that required finding a common ground between the flood resilience work and broader policy issues to some degree. So they needed to be able to translate what we were seeing and the language we were using in describing it to what was happening in the planning process, so that there were clear ties between those. The third example on our somewhat complicated piece at the top of success has been where teams have a really long history of advocacy and established relationships. And we see this particularly because successful influencing requires trust, and trust takes time. And so for the most part, the teams that we're seeing on the ground that are having the greatest policy and funding influence are the ones that have been doing this work for many years, not necessarily as alliance teams. There are a number of teams, and certainly the Red Cross teams are among them, where they're recognized in the country. Of course, they've played a very strong role for decades. And bringing those relationships into the work makes a really big difference. Next slide. So that encompasses a lot of this top path, where we've gone from stakeholder engagement through kind of increased awareness of the Alliance and improved awareness of flood resilience. Those are different. We both want people to know who we are as an alliance and what we're doing, but also recognize why resilience is a conversation we need to be having and what it takes to actually build flood resilience. The center circle really focuses on the way we're using knowledge in our work. And all of the three examples that I gave you on the previous slide leverage that knowledge. Knowledge of best practice on the ground, knowledge of how climate is likely to influence flooding in our communities, and therefore why we need to be proactive, and perhaps more proactive than we have in the past around flood resilience. And clear examples of what it means to build flood resilience in useful ways for communities on the ground. These are all really powerful tools in then influencing policy and spending. This in turn leads to gaining credibility within the Alliance and increased buy-in to what we're doing and interest in inviting us into policy dialogues. More people come to talk to us, they invite us to speak, and eventually that has led to increased policy influence and more investment. However, as I mentioned, at the bottom of the slide, we have a shortcut. Next slide. And we didn't really recognize the shortcut directly from the reporting that we saw in year 2 until we worked on this diagram. And that's when we realized, yes, we are doing this work. We're consistently doing this work. We're building up this work. But many of our wins are also just places where we have political influence. And part of why we have that political influence is because we're working as an alliance. Because we have different organizations with different networks and different contacts, with reputations that they've built over decades from really good work. It's because we combine research, which has one particular audience and network. We combine the humanitarian network that the IFRC brings in, the more sort of traditional development networks of many of the other implementing partners, and Zurich, who have their own business network and a very different profile than the rest of us. And working together, we've been able to access spaces that any one organization alone couldn't. And that's been really powerful. And it's something that, as we've more intentionally identified it, we now, I think, can use more intentionally as well moving forward. And some of the wins that we've seen from that include things like access to major policy forums like Insurance Europe and the EU Commission for Flood and Climate Change policy tracks. And we're excited about furthering this. And then the last slide. So just to reinforce, like, this diagram comes from the work. It's not that we created a diagram about how we thought this would work. This is what we're seeing on the ground. One of the biggest things I would note is that we've started looking at the information, the reporting information for year 3, and what we've realized is that our diagram needs to extend significantly to the right. That the work doesn't end when you have the improved policy. The work doesn't end when you have the funding earmarked. There are still a lot of work at that point to make sure it's well spent, that the policy is actually enforced, that the funding flows the way it was intended. And so those are places that we're looking forward to exploring in future. And it just highlights the way that this is kind of an ongoing learning process for everyone involved. Thanks. And with that, I will hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I mean, just looking at this flow chart, I really think this is a piece of art, actually. And I'm very much looking forward to the updated version, which is extended to the right. So it really illustrates how difficult it can be to do the advocacy work that we do. And well, sometimes we luckily have this shortcut at the bottom, but still remains very difficult. With this, David, I'm handing over to you. And thank you so much, Karen.
Thanks, Jonathan. If you could go on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about this. So the topic that I've been asked to kind of talk a little bit about is this idea of measurement and its role as a fundamental approach to what it is that the Alliance is able to do and why we're able to achieve kind of results. And I'd like to take you back just a little bit to the beginning of our work in flood resilience back in 2013-14. When Zurich first decided that this was a topic that we wanted to work with, we kind of set out to improve community resilience to flooding. And at the time, we had absolutely no idea how we were going to prove that we had improved communities' resilience to flooding. Resilience is a notoriously slippery concept, something that is very fuzzy around the edges, something where if you take 10 resilience experts and put them in a room, you'll get 15 different definitions for resilience coming out of. It's really hard to get hold of. We also at the time couldn't find, and something that was demonstrated a little later with a piece of research that UNDP did, we couldn't find a mechanism to be able to measure this slippery concept called resilience. In fact, there were plenty of papers around at the time that were saying that you can't measure resilience. Resilience is an incipient quality within a community that is just impossible to measure in itself. So we decided we'd set off on a journey to try and see what we could measure to demonstrate that we were having a positive impact. When you think about resilience, the kind of fundamentals of looking at a community that is more resilient is that when a disaster strikes, the outcomes that they face are better than they would have been if they didn't have resilience. So we're starting off from this whole premise that resilience has an outcome, that there is an outcome that we need to kind of look at. And that outcome comes from somewhere. It comes from what the community has and how the community functions to be able to provide it with those good outcomes. So we started off on this journey to try and create something that we could measure, something that is present within the community and something that can change over time, which in the long run will improve outcomes. And that led us to the FRMC approach, the flood resilience measurement for communities approach. It starts with a definition of what resilience is, which is this relationship between the risk and risk management and the development of a community, the way in which a community evolves in such a way that they mutually reinforce each other. It looks at what qualities within the community provide that and puts that all into the concept of the 5C4R model, looking fundamentally at the different kinds of assets a community has, or the capitals, and looking to see which ones are contributing and which ones are fairly weak and therefore might not contribute towards that. By measuring change of the quality of those assets over time, we can see that the potential for improvement in the community's outcomes will improve over time. So that's the kind of the direction that the whole measurement piece set out at. And that fundamentally is where we intended to go with the development of the FRMC. However, when you start to deploy this model on the ground, what has become apparent, certainly over the last couple of years, and certainly in the learning that's coming out from the reporting that we're doing, is that it goes much beyond just simply an opportunity to measure potential outcomes. And if we go on to the next slide, Jonathan, what we have found is that it also does two other things. Firstly, it supports good decision making in terms of what a community needs to do that could enhance its resilience. I'll come on to excuse me. I'll come on to each of these in just a moment. And the second one is that it builds a depth of understanding about what resilience actually is in reality, a much more concrete view of what resilience is than the fluffy, fuzzy definitions. So how does it do that? What are we learning that kind of supports this contention that the resilience measurement approach isn't just about measurement? It will do a measurement of some sort, but it also adds this additional value. Well, The first thing that we learned, if we get the next one, Jonathan, is that by deploying this tool before we even start to think about what kind of interventions or solutions and make any decisions about what kind of interventions or solutions happens, really does help us to think this thing through in a concrete kind of way. We shouldn't underestimate ever the value of early analysis of the situation before we start making decisions, and having the scope and the flexibility to deploy this approach, to look in depth at where a community is, to help identify the strengths and the potential gaps that there are within the makeup of this community, really does help us to understand fundamentally what potential options there might be for development. There's always the kind of knee-jerk reaction. We all have our set piece interventions that we've tried and tested in multiple places, but do they really work in all situations? What this tool does and what this approach does, which is coming out in the evidence from a number of the teams that are reporting on this, is that it really helps us to really understand that difference between a strength and a gap, and how they interact, and what potential we have for being able to overcome some of those gaps, and be much clearer about the way in which that works. It's all done in a very participatory way as well, and in the sense of bringing a sense of ownership with the community that we're working with. So really identify the gaps that are important to the community as much as anything else. One illustration for kind of how this has really helped is that we have successfully had the tool embedded into a partner's work who is outside of the Flood Resilience Alliance. The Lutheran World Relief Project on the border between Nepal and India, for example, started off liking the look of the tool, implementing the tool in 3 or 4 pilot communities, and eventually trebling the number of communities that they applied the tool to, not necessarily because of the measurement angle, which is where they started, but simply because it was demonstrated to them how it could support better decision making on the ground. Could take the next one, please, Jonathan. What that is kind of illustrating, I think, is not only that we're able to quantify where the gaps are and where the strengths are, but it's also enabling us to connect that knowledge together, to be able to understand how those pieces of information interact, where they reinforce each other or undermine each other, and by doing it in a participatory way, connect that to what the community really needs. So instead of just making a guess as to the best approach within a community to what they need, it really does engage the community in an in-depth way to really analyse the situation on the ground in partnership with the community, and to evolve an understanding about what options come out from that kind of depth of discussion within that. Ultimately, it connects this understanding to the community's need, and so we're addressing real needs and not ones that we potentially imagine. And the next one, please, Jonathan. And that kind of leads us to a wider application of this whole kind of picture. So at a community level, it's quite straightforward to see that by really understanding where the strengths and weaknesses of the individual community lie, the needs of that community can come out, and whether that need can be satisfied within the community by harnessing the strengths of that community itself to overcome some of the weaknesses, or whether we need to go outside of that community and lobby for an external influence, comes out from the analysis within this tool. So it enables us to really focus in on what we can do with the community and what we can do with the community to advocate for change outside. And when we take that collectively across a cluster of communities within a district, then that can really turn into some powerful information that we can take to larger municipal kind of stakeholders to look to see where we can get that information to leverage input from the authorities. Municipal authorities in Nepal, for example, the work that Practical Action have done in Nepal, have been able to adjust their fiscal plans and allocate budgets specifically around resilience building based on what is coming out of the work that we're doing with communities in that particular region. The information that's coming from the tool collectively is making a sound argument for change for the way in which those budgets are allocated, which is a real success story and part of what we're trying to drive through the whole of the programme. In terms of the other side of this coin, and you can see this kind of diagram. On the one side, you've got all of these pieces moving together. On the other side, you've got this opportunity for building capacity. Now, the Alliance is a learning organisation, and we learn in a number of different ways. We learn through events such as this. We learn deliberately by going to learning events, or we can learn by experience and through experience. The very fact of the way in which we deploy this tool in the first place is a learning opportunity. Building and designing data collection questionnaires forces us to think about what the data is asking for and how best to get that data and why we need that data in the first place. And all of that helps to build a good understanding of the sources that underpin where resilience comes from. Looking at the different kinds of data collection methods and where we get data from exposes us to a number of different viewpoints of that data, which means that we get different perspectives and can build a rounded understanding of what it's telling us, again helping to build our capacity and our knowledge. And when it comes to interpreting, grading and analysing that data, we have yet another opportunity to really kind of build our understanding of where resilience comes from and how we can behave to try to enact it. So the first one, if we can click the next one up, Jonathan, the first kind of element of this building capacity thing is that it really does support the way in which we're working to build and develop our knowledge. But it's not just our knowledge that we're building and developing. It's also around building a relationship at a community level. We do this in participation with the community. It's not something that we do to the community. It's something we do alongside the community as genuine partners in their development. It's their priorities that are coming out from this. It's their perspectives about what's important that's coming out from this. And that's a really key part of why we are able to learn what goes on the ground. We not only, the process of going through this not only helps build the capacity for practitioner teams, but it also builds an understanding of where resilience comes from at a community level. And that in itself builds resilience. If you can bring the next one up, please. The other thing that it does is it really helps to foster this idea of systems thinking. Now, a community is a series of interlocking moving parts, much like this diagram is. Whatever you do in a community, whatever things you change in a community will have not just intended consequences. We intend to change this to make that happen. But because it's all interrelated with everything else that goes on in the community, it also has knock-on effects and potentially could change other things that you weren't intending to change. The very process of looking at this measurement piece enables us to think of the community in this interlocked, multi-dimensional kind of way. And by looking at where the different pieces fit together, particularly through the analysis process, we can start to see where we might have positive intended consequences, where we might have unintended consequences, which may prove to be positive or negative, which will help to temper or to change or to nuance what it is we do on the ground. These linkages between strengths and weaknesses enable us to also harness those strengths within a community to be able to make change happen and overcome some of the weaknesses and bridge some of those gaps. And that we find has been a really important thing that's come out about the way in which these things all interlink together. Interestingly, what that kind of shows is not necessarily that we would do we would implement a different kind of solution, but the solution we implement will be nuanced. It'll have differences around the edges because it will take into account what were previously hidden unintended consequences. And the last thing it does, if we can get the next one up, Jonathan, is it provides this learning environment, a learning for the community, a learning for the practitioner, and a learning when we take it outside of the individual community, a learning for the whole of the ecosystem in which we're working. What it does is it takes a very fuzzy, difficult concept in the nature of resilience and breaks that down into things that are concrete, that are real, that are things that we can tackle, that we know will have a significant impact on the community. So overall, we set off on this journey to try to measure whether we were able to increase resilience in the community. And what we've ended up with from the feedback we're getting from the practitioners on the ground is a tool that can do that, yes, but equally something that helps us to really build our understanding of resilience in a very concrete and practical way to be able to deploy solutions and to make decisions about which solutions we apply in a much more systematic and thought through way, all done in tandem with the community. So overall, the FRMC is proving to be the thing that drives the heart of what we're doing at the programme, and something which we can be very proud of. Thank you. I'll pass this on to Brenda.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate your insights and just to strongly support what we hear consistently, going back to that map slide we saw earlier about where we're currently operating as an alliance family. What we hear consistently from country colleagues is how the FRMC could be used for many purposes, not only informing our direct programming, but as you laid out, for example, a strong foundation for advocacy and influence. So thank you so much. With that, we're going to turn to Brenda. So the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, David. Try to explaining what was the experience of the Red Cross in Mexico. It's quite difficult because we have a lot of experience, new challenge that I would like to share with you a little bit how we live the past floods, combine it with COVID and another risks in the area of work. So please, the first one slide, please, from the presentation. Okay, so working in a context that we consider normal has their implication and challenge, and one of our biggest challenge was to devise actions to work together with the people and motivate them to take action for risk reduction with their own conviction. They were convinced that they are doing the right thing for their community and their families. And thinking about other challenge was also part of the initial task, such as the context, the security, and the social conflicts, the health risk due to the endemic or local disease. And the occurrence of floods was also something that we can see coming from the beginning of the project. So in an emergency, it's clear to us that it is important to know the social context in order to define the channels of communication, the predisposition of the population to protect themselves, and obviously trying that they act in an emergency situation. and as well as the local resources that are available in the communities to face a disaster. So as Red Cross, well, we have the first challenge. We are known as an emergency response institution. So in terms of preparation, we have had to maintain communication with people to raise awareness about resilience activities and strengthening the systems, the local system, the community system, the social systems to trying to mitigate the impact of the events of the floods. And another important point is to previously guide or orient to the people on what to do to face flood and review their strengths, the capacities, and their vulnerabilities. That all of these aspects were identified previously in the work that we made with the community in the vulnerable capacities analysis and the use of the FRNC. And this last point helped us to delimit the actions during the emergency as a resilience team that we are during this event. So we can see three main questions that we have to be very clear. You can see pictures that they were sent from the communities, from the community brigade to us, because we were not there when the floods occurred. So we have to have very clear what was the context of the community to know what and how we can help them. Does the community were expecting from us, because we are Red Cross, we have a human aid or the ambulance or what the field teams have to do. And obviously we have to define what can and what should we do in the communities. Next one, please. So what happens in context, and if we have an event with even higher, when we have an event with even higher priority implications, not only for the communities, but also for the field team. And I'm talking about COVID-19. We have these big risks for everyone. And we have to act under many situations, many aspects. So we have to try to take decisions. We have to plan. We have to readjust, readapt, and then try in the communities do the same. In the October and November floods in the southern Mexico last year, we are not only dealt with the COVID pandemic, but also we had health risks such dengue, as well as the social discontent over the management of the government aid, and to face the emergency. Well, this was not it was not a good scenario for the work, especially if we take into account that we had been away from from face-to-face activities for months, maybe 3-4 months. We were just contacting people through text, by phone. And so one thing was clear: the flood is like a prompt us to return back to the communities, but readapting the way that we worked. Next one, please. So this picture I like so much. What you see in this photo represents a lot for us as an institution, because you can see two teams. We can observe the moment when the resilience teams connect with the Red Cross response team. So they are planning to the recovery actions, and the field team, the resilience team, provide the detail of the communities, which include the risk map, a census of the community, the information about key people to carry out the recovery operation. And this also transcends to the communities, because when the response teams arrive to the communities with the humanitarian aid, there were community brigades helping and supporting the distribution, guiding the response teams, and it was easier under the circumstances. Or even there was no COVID, it was easier to difference with another communities, the work with other communities. So the process, so we had a process that we applied, a sequence in order to attend the emergency under our framework of resilience, and under the situation of flood and under the situation of COVID. So the next one, this, okay. We start with community awareness. This was part of our resilience activities, trying to work to this and with the people in this sense. And it was not only about COVID, but the flood preparedness measure. We continue with a review of the social structure in the communities and how to organize them remotely, because we cannot be there. So just trying to send messages and trying to understand how they are organizing. So we had to adjust the protection and health protocols for the work team to return to the, but also we had to establish the protocols that community had to recognize and carry out. We provide the team with personal equipment and to protect themselves. With also this also help us to promote the care in the communities. And this part, the community healthcare, it was as part of the resilience program. We follow up on the flood and health implications. We have to reinforce the cleanup and community health and sanitation activities. We provide, we give to the community groups a guidance for the link with the government institutions in the face to face the emergency. This point was more specific with the communities of the first phase in Jonuta. We can linkage just to know how is the advocacy in the level of resilience. And finally, we supported the distribution of humanitarian aid for recovery, as I mentioned. Next, please. So we can see some challenge. Well, we have to help us and help the community to differentiate the emergency and resilience actions, because emergency is just to be for a moment giving some stuff for recovery, but resilience are more about training or social organization. So we have to work with the community, and it was crucial maybe for us to work in how previous resilience work facilitated the emergency. And the second challenge was that people had to prioritize their needs. And months before, we were talking only about COVID, and during the flood, they relaxed in many measures because the water was inside their houses. So the challenge in that moment was to manage both topics of both points at the same time. And the third challenge was, well, in the Mexican context, the aid topic or the aid issue always tends to become politicized. So we let the community lead us the way in how to approach the aid to the communities and recovery actions. They say how was the best way to help them in that context without create confusions about the politics. And well, as the big lesson learned from this case in Mexico was the communication. remote or face-to-face was I think that it was one of the great pillars during the emergency within the framework of the resilience work. And just to point what Karen and David told about this process, I think it has a lot of sense talking about the Mexican case in this case, because the experience of the Red Cross demonstrates that, as the current diagram, sometimes it seems like a road without exit, but it's just we have continued to make decisions to achieve the goal. And yes, as David explained, the functioning of this machine for capacity building, it starts with triggering by making decisions, the correct decisions to make all the rest of the wheels work. And it's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And not only for the presentation, but actually for the amazing work of you and your team in the past year. As we could just see, and we could always remotely observe from Geneva, in the face of these compounding risks of COVID, and floods, and dengue at the same time, all in a politically difficult context, you and your team, you showed like great adaptability and agility to support the communities that we serve. So thank you so much for this. Francisco, I hope you're ready. I'm handing over to you for the panel discussion. And just quickly as a reminder, you can already ask your questions or leave your comments in the chat, either privately or in the public chat, and we will then pick them up for the discussion. So over to you, Francisco.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. And again, such a sincere thanks for your insights, Karen, David, Bren. You know, advocacy, measurement, and what it looks and feels like in practice certainly, I think, takes our brains to different places. So hopefully there's some questions from colleagues. Maybe just to kick it off for the three of you is this issue that, you know, John was just mentioning of compounding risk, compounding impacts. So curious to hear your perspectives in terms of looking at the future. What advice do you have to address compounding impacts of COVID, floods, and other hazards? So open question to Karen, David, or Brenda.
I'm going to take the word. Well, I think one of the something that it has helped us, it was the health and safety protocols. Without them, we cannot hide that guidance and act with care for us, with care for the communities. So I think the health protocols adjust this. Not only the community has to adapt the new circumstances, all our documents, all our way of work, we have knowing new ways of work. So we have to readapt constantly, not just one adjustment, but every week, every day, we have to rethink the way we are going into the communities, how they are link each other, how they are their expectation, their perception, their risk perceptions, until the COVID was part of their day by day as floods suddenly occur. So we have to reinforce this protocol, they reinforce our speech with the communities. And I think it has worked a lot with us.
I think if I can come in and add to that, Francisco, I think the interesting thing about our approach from the FRMC's perspective is it has always had a single hazard lens, and that comes from a recognition that resilience in general is a really unknowable concept, but trying to understand what resilience means in terms of who is being more resilient, what are they being more resilient to, when are they needing to be more resilient, how are they being more resilient? All of those kinds of questions, I think, enables us to kind of focus it in on the hazard that we're facing at the time. Now, obviously, right now is a really great example. In many places, we have a flood risk and a flood hazard that's coming. But layered on top of that is the health risk that a pandemic puts into play. And what that does is automatically create a different circumstance in which you're looking to kind of build resilience. So I don't think it's necessarily a case of changing the fundamental understanding of what do you need to be resilient in a flood. It means layering a nuance on top of that that says, and how does that work if there's also a health crisis? You know, if you're looking to try and create an evacuation centre, for example, to enable people to get out of the way of a flood whilst it kind of passes through, what does that evacuation centre need to look like if there's a pandemic around? Because clearly you can't go cramming 500 people into a very small space with no opportunity to be socially distanced. You need to think about sanitation and being able to hand wash and so on in a way that protects other people. So there's all kinds of other questions, I think, that starts to come into here. So the compounding nature of it, I think, just means that we need to not just think about how the primary challenge is affecting us, but wherever we try and address that primary challenge, think about how that would work with the secondary challenge being piled on top of it. So I do think that there is some interesting opportunities we have for using the thinking behind how these things work together to really kind of get a different outcome and design things in a different way. We'll probably do the same kinds of things, but do them in a more nuanced way, and that will help us to deal with both risks at the same time.
Thank you so much, Brenda and David, for those insights. John, I note some questions in the chat. I don't know if you're able to read them out or get those comments out to the panelists, and then after that, we also invite others if you want to simply just raise your hand or chime in with your comment. But first, let's maybe address these that are being written. John?
Yes, thank you, Francisco, and also thank you, Karen, David, and Brenda again. So now turning to the questions asked in the chat. We have a couple of questions in the public chat, but also some questions that I've received privately. And since I received the letter first, we will start with these. But before, I just saw in the chat that someone tried to access our resilience portal, our website, and face some problems. We will look into that, of course, and it should be online and live and safe, hopefully soon again. So starting with the questions, I think there are two questions on influencing policy that I would like to combine. The one question is, what are the key challenges we face while influencing the policy, while we influence policy and investment, as well as making common understanding among the partners? And the second question on this is, how do governments rethink flood resilience management and flood risk management when they learn about the resilience measurement and about the policy interventions? I think this question, maybe we can start with Karen, since we spoke about the spending influenced and advocacy, and then anyone else who wants to jump in from our speakers can jump in.
So I know on the question of what do governments do with this information, the London School of Economics has been working with the town of Lowestoft in the UK and with Cologne in Germany. And I know in both of those locations, the the sort of city planners have been the ones implementing the FRMC, and it's broadened their thinking about what it means to do flood resilience, particularly, I think, in developed contexts, though it happens across the world. There's a rush to gray infrastructure. Well, let's put a levee along the river, and then we'll just keep the water out. And it's really broadening their thinking about what it means to build resilience to flooding, and the wide range of ways you can do that, and the wide range of sectors that you need at the table and part of the discussion. And that's really powerful. If we can get people talking across sectors, it will create change. In Nepal, what we're seeing is it's shifting the dialogue around, oh, we do need regular funding for disaster risk reduction. That if we try to keep doing this piecemeal, we can't get the kind of traction and ongoing development and continual year-on-year capacity building that we need to really make a difference. So those, I know, are a couple of examples that we're seeing, and I suspect Brenda has, you know, her own on-the-ground examples that will perhaps be more powerful.
Yeah, well, it's always complicated to follow up this decision making when we are looking the system top to down, and it was very difficult that people understand why are the decisions making, and it's difficult to understand by the government why communities are responding in that way. The management of the floods were very peculiar in the last floods in Tabasco, and that I think in many ways it was new for everyone, because we had a pandemic, because we had new rules of the game in risk management. So we are trying to figure out how a community can collaborate more effective with the government and the decisions, because we had a lot of implementations tools. It was more about recovery than prevention. It's just the early warning system was very weak, but the recovery, I think it seems like it was a little acceptable and successful, because the government applied kind of cash transfer for the communities and recovery. So it's a thing that we have to analyze, but definitely how it's the big questions that you made. How our government manage the risk, and how the people think that it's a correct way, but it seems like it's just for a short term. It's not for long terms.
Thank you, Karen and Brenda. David, do you also want to add to this, or shall we move on to the next question, because we have quite many in the chat?
I'd move on.
All right. There's one interesting question that I also received privately, asking about the sustainability of our activities in the area of knowledge management, but also other interventions after phasing out the project. So how do we ensure that the impact we are having lives longer than our community interventions themselves? On this note, we just published a 3-piece blog series on the flood resilience portal exactly on this topic, so you can read up on the portal, but also would like, of course, to hear from our speakers. So whoever wants to go first, to you.
So, Jonathan, I mean, from my perspective, sustainability almost comes as a matter of the process. If you think about the way in which the tool is applied at a community level, it is a completely participatory approach. So the intention from the very outset is this is done in partnership and collaboration with the community. It's not something that is imposed or provided or given to the community as a gift. It is something that is evolved from a deep understanding of what the community needs, an understanding of what the community's capacity is, and the harnessing of that capacity to try and find ways in which things can improve. And I think the very nature of the way in which we're working leads to a long-term impact for much of the things that go on. Obviously, where you're then relying upon external agents to come in and provide support, that may change as the kind of pressure comes off from our organisations being on the ground trying to put pressure on. But one of the things that we hope, I think, that can come out of that is that we empower the community whilst they're harnessing their capacity. So in terms of who can be advocating for change for themselves, it's largely the community that will be doing that.
Thank you, David. Karen, I saw you raised your hand, so over to you.
And I would add, a big part of the work that we're doing and the way we're working builds really strong relationships. And what we've seen is that with the onset of COVID, those relationships were easily transferred to meet the new peril. And so a big part of the sustainability is that we're not just coming in and doing the work, we're facilitating the work, but it's connecting the community to the local government. It's giving them the tools they need to articulate their needs more clearly. And we're already seeing that it's sustainable, that we didn't have to be on the ground with the communities for them to take action on their behalf in the face of COVID. And we've seen that across many of our communities across the globe.
Thank you, Karen. Brenda, do you also want to add on this? Or shall we pick the next one?
Yeah, well, and talk about sustainability. It depends on the point of view or the approach that we are working with the community. We try that all the actions keep working after we leave the communities, and they go. They keep going and go. But we can see a little bit. We didn't realize what is the scope of this work until we had the opportunity to see the brigades of the first phase. We are not working day by day after 2 years, 3 years now with the communities. And after that, we realized that the community brigades, you can see the picture. The picture, the brigades that you are seeing, the picture, they are the brigades from the first phase, and the picture is the last flood. So they continue organizing. They now, for as response teams, they are our referent in the communities, and I think that's a good example of sustainability of the actions. How we worked with them for years. In awareness about the social organization, about the social cohesion, and then we had a little bit of the result. We have to work, we have to keep working on other issues about the maybe paying attention in another vulnerabilities. But I think now we understand the importance of working with this kind of perspective about the sustainability, because without people, without social organizations, we cannot see the other things. I think that this is the most close that I have as an example for the sustainability. And then they can trigger another actions coming from the organizations, coming from the institutions. It's easier for another organizations to invest with an organized community that start from the scratch. That I can share.
Thank you so much to all of you for the answers. There's another really good question in the chat from a researcher who's also working on resilience and building models. And there's the perception that sometimes there's a disconnect or a gap between the data and the practice on the ground, and that it's sometimes difficult for field workers to work with the data and the research while there are so many other competing priorities. So how would you say, from your different perspectives, maybe how can we solve this gap and bridge this gap between decision makers and research? Whoever wants to take that question. Karen, I see your hand.
This is an area that we're continuing to work and continuing to learn. What's been interesting is seeing how deep an understanding you need of what policymakers, what information they need to inform their process, and then find the ways to connect that with the information you're creating on the ground. And those two bodies of information don't always line up really effortlessly. It takes some adjustment and fiddling, and particularly, you know, it's I think much easier when you're using data from a community to influence a local government, because they're so much closer, and there are fewer gaps between those thinking processes. But where we're still working to overcome the challenges between the bodies of information and how to connect them is, how do you take information from a local community and use it to influence global discussions and processes? And we're getting clearer. We're digging deeper, particularly into the data we're collecting through the flood resilience measurement tool, because we've seen how powerful that is at the local level and at the provincial level. And in some cases, it's starting to influence or be used in national level discussions. So how do we then bring that into the global discussions as well? But it's a challenge. You know, the global discussions aren't well tailored to address the needs at individual community levels. And so how do we aggregate across what we're doing in ways that are powerful?
I think Jonathan, to kind of build on that, it's really difficult to aggregate from communities that, frankly, 1 kilometre apart are very different from each other. So you get one measurement of one community and you add it to a measurement of another community, which is by its nature different, and then you add it to another community, you add it to another community, and you end up aggregating into a kind of a grey mush, where there is no coherence coming from the data, because actually the value of it is in the drill down, rather than at the kind of aggregating it up to a kind of more onto bigger levels. So we're always going to have that kind of fundamental challenge, I think, because of the nature of the kind of data we're gathering, and the level at which we're gathering it. Where we can start to say, I think, something interesting is by using the data as examples of information, and trying to bring out, for example, how well money is reaching communities, and we can use examples to illustrate either a hypothesis that it's reaching it well or not reaching it well, and use that as an argument in one way or another. But I think the data is always going to be really challenging. Part of the reason, of course, that the data is going to be challenging is because it's not extracted for data purposes. It's taken out of the community, or rather it's brought out with the community, so the community can understand itself a little better and be able to use it for their development. So it's always going to be a challenge for us, I think, to use the information behind the FRMC. It's a challenge that we're rising to. It's something that we're trying to find a way around, but it's a significant issue.
Brenda, over to you. I see you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that also it's very important. It's not just collect the data; it's how community interprets their own risk and then how we interpret the risk of the communities. And this is, for example, in the Alliance, we had specific questions, and this help us to have some kind of guidance to interpret the information. But I think the biggest challenge is how to put all this information in the attention of the stakeholders, how face the reality, maybe with what a few communities say versus what all the world state of the nation is passing by. And so I think it's a very challenge of interpretation for the risk from the community, and the interpretation, the risk of from the decision maker, the politics. And to match both of that, I think is this challenge for us, how to present the information that we collect and select what they can use for convenience, not politics. In CSM, we have a big problem on politics, but it's a big challenge for us, the interpretation of data.
Thank you to all of you. We have 6 more minutes left until the official end of the meeting, the webinar, and there are still quite a few questions. There are 2 questions with regards to funding mobilization. So one is that we as the Alliance having this aim of influencing $1 billion to go into pre-event resilience building. So what are the lessons learned in terms of funding mobilization to reach this target? And then there's also a question, again, going back to the debate on sustainability of our interventions, that this is also dependent, of course, on funding for the community, for local authorities to actually carry forward what we started. So maybe this discussion on funding mobilization to end on this discussion, over to you. And for all other questions, please reach out and follow up and bilaterally. Anyone wants to go first on funding mobilization? Karen, it's a difficult
I can.
question.
It is. It's an interesting question because it gets at the heart of who has money. And so what we're seeing is that funding commitments at the national level currently exceed those at the local or global levels, in part because the global levels aren't committing money so much as setting a policy landscape, or where there are funds, it's much harder to say, yes, we have meaningfully influenced that because there's so many players. It's at the national and subnational level where we can say, yes, we influence that process. And we're, as an alliance, that's really important to us, that we don't just wave our hands about this, but that we can really tie back to how we influenced a particular piece of funding. The other challenge, of course, is that OECD countries have more money than the rest of the globe. So to date, our largest wins have been in OECD contexts, which glosses over the fact that much smaller sums of money may have much greater impact. So a 5% budget commitment at a municipal or provincial level in Nepal may do more to influence lives on the ground than a very large funding bill in the UK. And so as we look at the funding we've influenced, we want to look beyond the numbers to the impact as well.
Thank you, Karen. David or Brenda, do you want to add to this question?
Just to say, or to reinforce the fact that I think Karen is entirely right here, that we set off with a very big kind of number target because we need to measure ourselves up against something. But that number target could be shattered if, for example, something like the GCF decided that it was going to pump particular money into resilience in a particular way. We suddenly would find that our target was very easily met. What is more important is always more important with any efforts that kind of try to help communities to develop, is the impact of the financing they're having and looking at what the outcomes of that money is. Clearly, if a national government commits to make a spending commitment on building flood resilience, but for political reasons it's announced it at a particular time with no intention of the money being available, or it's announced it in a double counting kind of way, which governments are prone to do, or it's announced it with no idea how it's going to deliver it, then it may well get unspent. I used to work in a mental health sector, for example, in India, and one of the things that frequently happened was the central federal government structure in Delhi used to push money down to the districts, or to the states rather, to spend on a district mental health program. And the states had no clue how to spend it. Most of their local infrastructure wasn't geared up to spending it. It was unspent at the end of the year and sent back. So there is a need for us, I think, to not just look at the quantum of this, but also look at the impact of it as well, which again is a work in progress. I think we need to be thinking about how to monitor and track those things, and whether tracking 10,000 here is worthwhile doing compared to tracking 2 billion there, which would be worthwhile doing. So it's definitely a work in progress. We don't have the answers at the moment.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I still want to give you the chance to speak if you want to before closing. So do you want to add to?
Yeah, I'd just like to add something about this big topic about the investment, and just talking from my side about the operation. I think we have to be clear with other organizations, with other institutions about what we are investing in. If we are investing in avoid flooding, or reinforcing capacities, or just giving information to the communities, because it can be confused, because other organizations has come to me and if I invest, you can avoid the floods in the community. No, we are not just like that. It's another way. But I think it was become clearer, and it's clear when you show that you are investing in a continuous process, to see the resilience as a process, not just an action, because as an action is not resilience. And that is how you can project and understand how and what is the return on investment is. I think it's just to be clear with another that understand what is the investment in this kind of programs of resilience.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much to our speakers, and also for the very interesting and sometimes difficult questions. I'm very sorry for having to interrupt the discussion. Well, we are actually already 1 minute over time. So if your questions remained unanswered, or if you have further questions or comments, please reach out. As said in the very beginning, we're recording this webinar. We will share the recording. I will also see whether we can share the slides. I will send them around. You will have my email address. You can always reach me by email, or you can reach us on the different flood resilience portals that you see here on the screen. So we have different portals where you can learn more about the Alliance, and you also find a wealth of resources related to flood, multi-hazard resilience, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and so much more. You can also find us on Twitter. So if you're not following us already, please do so. We're tweeting quite intensively every day. So we'll always be up to date to the Alliance activities. with this, thank you so much again to our speakers, Karen, David, Brenda. Thank you so much, Francisco, for co-moderating with me. And thanks to all of you for joining today. I hope that we were able to share some of the lessons we've learned. I think we already learned a lot from the discussion and from your questions. Thanks so much for joining. Take care, stay safe, and see you next time.